The afternoon my nephew Preston suggested I sell my little house to afford a decent retirement home was the moment I decided my secret had lived long enough. For half a century, I had watched as my family dismissed my career choice, pitied my modest lifestyle, and ultimately deemed me a financial failure. The champagne flute nearly slipped from Preston's manicured fingers when I revealed my portfolio worth $7 million. His expression, shock melting into disbelief, then crystallizing into something I'd never seen directed at me before, respect, is an image I'll treasure forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the choices that led me here, and to the moment I finally reclaimed my worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwell, though generations of students at Heathcliff Academy knew me simply as Ms. Blackwell, the mathematics teacher with the tortoise-shell glasses and chalk-dusted cardigans. I never married, never had children of my own, and according to my family, never amounted to much beyond being just a teacher. How little they understood about the life I had carefully constructed. Growing up in Meridian Heights during the Ejo 1950s, I was the middle child sandwiched between two brothers who commanded attention effortlessly. Nathaniel, my older brother, was destined for medical school from the moment he dissected his first frog in our backyard. Xavier, the youngest, had our father's charisma and business acumen. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one who could solve complex equations in my head before I turned 12. A talent that impressed my mathematics teacher, Ms. Vivian Reynolds, but went largely unnoticed at home. Eleanor has such a practical mind, my mother would say to her bridge club ladies, her voice tinged with something between pride and apology. She'll make someone an excellent wife someday. She can balance the checkbook. The ladies would titter politely while I pretended not to hear from my homework spot at the dining room table. When I announced my intention to study mathematics, at Westlake College, my father's response was tepid at best. Teaching is a sensible career for a woman, he conceded over dinner. At least until you start a family. The assumption was clear. My career would be temporary, a placeholder until my real life began. Nathaniel was already in his residency at Lakeside Memorial by then, and Xavier was being groomed to take over our father's investment firm. Neither questioned their paths. Neither was expected to. I graduated with honors in 1972 and accepted my first teaching position at Heathcliff Academy, a respected private school in Lakeshire, 20 miles from my childhood home. The starting salary was $6,800 annually. My mother called it pin money. My father called it a shame. I called it independence. My apartment on Marigold Street was small enough that you could practically touch opposite walls if you stretched out your arms. The refrigerator hummed an inconsistent tune, and the floorboards creaked with every step. But it was mine. I bought second-hand furniture, learned to cook simple meals, and drove a used Datsun that backfired dramatically on cold mornings. During my third year of teaching, a peculiar opportunity presented itself. Vivian Reynolds, my former teacher who had since become a mentor and friend, invited me to coffee at Penelope's Cafe on Whittier Boulevard. She was retiring after 35 years and moving to Arizona to be closer to her sister. "I've never been one for sentimentality, Eleanor," she said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "But I've watched you closely. You remind me of myself at your age, smart with numbers, less so with people." Her laugh was warm, softening the assessment. Inside this envelope is something I wish someone had given me when I was starting out. I expected teaching materials, lesson plans maybe, or notes on challenging students. Instead, I found detailed investment strategies, stock recommendations, and a handwritten letter that began, "The world will tell you that teaching is a calling, not a career. That the rewards are intangible, not financial. They are wrong. You can have both." Vivian had been investing methodically since 1943, putting aside a portion of each paycheck into carefully researched opportunities. While her colleagues complained about the teacher's salary and looked forward only to their pensions, she had quietly amassed a small fortune. "People will make assumptions about you based on your profession," she told me, stirring her tea with precise movements. "Let them. There is power in being underestimated, Eleanor. Use it." That afternoon changed the trajectory of my life. I opened my first investment account the following week with $500, nearly a month's rent, but a sacrifice I was willing to make. I developed a system. 15% of each paycheck went directly into investments, another 10% into savings, and I lived modestly on the rest. When I received a raise, I increased my investment percentage rather than my standard of living. My family, meanwhile, continued along their predetermined paths. Nathaniel married Corinne, a pediatrician with family money and connections, and they built a sprawling Tudor-style home in Oakwood Estates. Xavier took over our father's firm and expanded it considerably, acquiring smaller companies with the same ease that some people acquire new shoes. They had children, Preston, Abigail, and Josephine, who grew up with every advantage, attending elite schools and taking expensive European vacations. At family gatherings, usually hosted at Nathaniel's home with its marble countertops and original artwork, the conversation inevitably turned to money, renovations, investments, property values, private school tuitions. I would listen quietly, offering little. What could just a teacher contribute to such discussions? "How's school, Ellie?" Nathaniel would ask, using my childhood nickname despite knowing I preferred Eleanor. His tone was the same one he used with his young patients, gently condescending. "The children are well," I would reply, because that was what they expected. To hear that I was fulfilled by my work with the children. They didn't want to know about my fascination with financial markets, my growing portfolio, or the small rental properties I had begun to acquire. When I purchased my house on Hawthorne Drive in my 15th year of teaching, my family assumed I had stretched myself thin to afford it. The Victorian cottage with its gingerbread trim and wraparound porch needed work. The roof leaked in 3 places, the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1940s, and the garden had grown wild with neglect. "Oh, Eleanor," Corinne sighed during her only visit, touching the faded wallpaper with her fingertips as if it might contaminate her. "It's quaint. Nathaniel, perhaps we could help with some renovations as a Christmas gift?" What they didn't know was that I had paid for the house in cash, no mortgage necessary. By then, my portfolio had grown to include a diverse mix of blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and 3 small rental properties managed discreetly by Harrington Property Services. The leaking roof and outdated kitchen were strategic choices. I was willing to live with imperfection while my money worked harder elsewhere. I renovated gradually, paying cash for each improvement. The kitchen gained cherry cabinets and granite countertops. The bathrooms were updated with marble and brushed nickel fixtures. The garden, my true passion, transformed into a showcase of perennials that strangers would slow their cars to admire. All the while, my investments continued to compound. Teaching brought me genuine joy that no balance sheet could reflect. I specialized in making mathematics accessible to students who had been told they weren't math people. Watching a concept click for a struggling student, seeing that moment when confusion transformed into comprehension, was a reward beyond measure. Over the decades, I taught thousands of students. Zachariah Pembroke, who could barely add fractions, when he entered my classroom, later became an aerospace engineer. Octavia Wesley, so timid she would whisper her answers, went on to become the CFO of a Fortune 500 company. Dominic Torres, who worked after school to help support his family, earned a full scholarship to Princeton and later founded an educational technology company. They would write to me sometimes, send holiday cards, or stop by when visiting Lakeshore. "You changed my life, Ms. Blackwell," they would say in various ways. They didn't know that while I was teaching them about polynomials and probability, I was silently amassing wealth that would have astonished them. My brother's children grew into adults with expensive tastes and entitlement that troubled me. Preston followed Xavier into finance but lacked his father's instincts. Abigail married into old money and spent her days on charity committees and tennis courts. Josephine, perhaps the most genuine of the three, became a dermatologist with a practice catering to Lakeshire's elite. They treated me with the distracted affection one might show an elderly pet. Occasional visits, perfunctory holiday gifts, usually scented candles or bath sets, and the unspoken assumption that I would need their help eventually. After all, what could a retired teacher possibly have saved for her golden years? When I retired at 72, after 50 years at Heathcliff Academy, the school held a reception in the gymnasium. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Former students spanning 5 decades attended, sharing stories about their time in my classroom. The current headmaster, Thaddeus Wellington, presented me with a crystal apple and announced that the mathematics wing would henceforth be known as the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Center. My family attended out of obligation. They stood awkwardly among my former students and colleagues, clearly surprised by the turnout and the genuine affection directed toward me. "I had no idea you were so popular, Aunt Eleanor," Preston remarked as we drove to the obligatory family dinner afterward. "Teaching must have been rewarding in its own way, I suppose." The condescension in his voice was familiar, the same tone my father had used decades earlier. Teaching was acceptable, admirable even, but not impressive. Not like medicine or finance, not like real success. The years after retirement brought new freedoms. I traveled extensively, a literary tour of England, a mathematics conference in Tokyo, 3 weeks exploring the architecture of Barcelona. I volunteered at a women's financial literacy program, teaching basics of investing to single mothers and women re-entering the workforce. I expanded my garden and joined a botanical photography club. My family interpreted my activities as the desperate busyness of a lonely old woman. "It's good that Aunt Eleanor keeps herself occupied," I overheard Abigail telling her husband at Thanksgiving. "It must be hard being all alone in that house." The conversation that changed everything happened last month, at my 78th birthday dinner. They had taken me to Bellamy's, an overpriced restaurant where the portions were tiny and the waitstaff overly familiar. Preston had ordered an expensive bottle of champagne, making a show of instructing the sommelier on the proper serving temperature. "Aunt Eleanor," he began, swirling his champagne with practiced nonchalance, "we've been talking, and we think it's time you consider your future arrangements." Josephine reached for my hand across the table. "What Preston means is that we're concerned about you living alone in that big old house. The stairs, the maintenance, it's a lot for someone your age." "We've looked into some retirement communities," Abigail added, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "Willowbrook Gardens has lovely apartments and excellent care options. As your needs progress, they can accommodate accordingly." Preston cleared his throat. "The thing is, Aunt Eleanor, these quality facilities aren't cheap. But if you sold your house, you could probably afford a nice unit at Willowbrook. We could help with the sale, of course. I know a real estate agent who specializes in older properties that need some updating to reach their full market potential." I took a slow sip of champagne, feeling a strange calm settle over me. For 50 years, I had kept my financial life private, partly out of habit and partly because I recognized the power in being underestimated. But sitting there, watching my family plan my diminished future based on assumptions they had never bothered to question, I decided it was time. "Preston," I said, setting down my glass, "what makes you think I need to sell my house to afford a retirement community?" He exchanged glances with his sisters. "Well, Aunt Eleanor, teachers' pensions aren't exactly generous, and while your house has appreciated, Hawthorne Drive isn't the most desirable location. After capital gains taxes and settling any outstanding mortgage— I have no mortgage, I interrupted quietly. I paid cash for the house in 1987. There was a moment of confused silence. That's not possible, Preston said finally. On a teacher's salary. On a teacher's salary, I continued. Combined with 50 years of consistent investing and compound interest, quite a lot is possible. I opened my handbag and removed a document, the latest statement from my financial advisor, Marguerite Chen, who had taken over after Vivian passed away. I slid it across the table just as Vivian had once slid that manila envelope to me. Preston picked it up, his expression skeptical. Then his eyes widened. He blinked rapidly, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more aligned with his expectations. This can't be right, he whispered. 6.7 million, I confirmed. Conservative estimate, according to Marguerite. That doesn't include my pension, Social Security, or the 4 rental properties I own in Lakeshore and Meridian Heights. Abigail reached for the statement. How is this possible? Compound interest is a powerful force, I replied, channeling. The teacher I had been for 5 decades. When I was 25, I invested 15% of every paycheck. When I was 35, that increased to 20%. By 50, it was 30%. I lived simply, avoided debt, and made careful choices. The rest is just time and mathematics. Josephine, always the most perceptive of the 3, studied my face. Why didn't you ever tell us? I considered the question carefully. Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was confused, that Aunt Eleanor couldn't possibly understand finance? More importantly, would it have changed how you saw me, not as a person, but as a resource? The table fell silent. In that moment, I saw my nieces and nephew clearly, not as the entitled adults they had become, but as children who had been taught to value the wrong things. They had been raised to equate worth with wealth, to measure success in square footage and luxury brands. And yet, here I was, wealthy beyond their imagination, having lived a life they had dismissed as insignificant. I don't need to sell my house, I said finally. And when the time comes that I can no longer live independently, I've already made arrangements that don't involve Willowbrook Gardens, but thank you for your concern. The waiter arrived with our entrees, breaking the stunned silence. The rest of the dinner passed in awkward conversation about safer topics: the weather, Preston's son's college applications, Abigail's recent kitchen renovation. As we waited for the valet to bring around their cars afterward, Preston approached me privately. Aunt Eleanor, he began, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years. I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been condescending. Yes, I agreed simply. He laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. You know, all these years, I thought I was the financial expert in the family. I never imagined. That's the problem with assumptions, Preston. They limit our vision. You saw a retired teacher with an old house and outdated clothes, and you created a story that made sense to you. I'd like to hear about your investment strategy sometime, he said, and for once, the interest in his voice seemed genuine. Maybe we could have lunch? I smiled. I'd like that. The following week, I had lunch not just with Preston, but with all 3 of my brother's children. For the first time, they asked about my teaching career with genuine interest. They wanted to know about my travels, my photography, my volunteer work. And yes, they asked about my investments, how I had started, what advice I would give them. The first thing to understand, I told them, channeling Vivian Reynolds from all those years ago, is that wealth isn't built overnight. It's built choice by choice, day by day, over decades. And true wealth isn't just financial. It's having work that matters, relationships that sustain you, and the freedom to live authentically. As I drove home to my little house on Hawthorne Drive, I thought about the generations of students I had taught, the lives I had influenced, and the quiet empire I had built while the world underestimated me. I thought about Vivian and the gift she had given me, not just financial knowledge, but the understanding that I could define success on my own terms. The garden needed weeding, and I had a financial literacy class to prepare for the next day. My life, at 78, was full in ways my family was only beginning to comprehend. There was satisfaction in that revelation, but also a certain sadness for the years of genuine connection we had missed. Still, I reminded myself as I pulled into my driveway, it's never too late to teach or to learn a valuable lesson, and some lessons, like compound interest, are worth the wait. The letter from Heathcliff Academy arrived on a Tuesday morning, the heavy cream-colored envelope, with the school's embossed crest unmistakable among the utility bills and marketing flyers. For a moment, I simply held it, running my fingers over the raised image of the old bell tower where generations of students had celebrated their graduations. Inside was a formal invitation to the school's centennial celebration, where I would be honored for my 50 years of service before officially entering retirement. I settled into my reading chair by the bay window overlooking my garden, where spring tulips were just beginning to emerge in organized battalions of red and yellow. The timing was serendipitous, though not entirely unexpected. The school board had been hinting at retirement for the past year, their suggestions becoming less subtle with each passing month. "Wouldn't you like to enjoy your golden years, Ms. Blackwell?" Headmaster Wellington had asked during our last faculty evaluation. What he meant, of course, was that at 78, I was an anomaly among the increasingly young teaching staff, a relic from another era. My retirement was scheduled for June, giving me just 3 months to tie up 5 decades of teaching mathematics to the privileged youth of Lakeshire. 3 months to clear out my classroom, organize my materials, and prepare to hand over my beloved students to someone new. The thought brought an unexpected tightness to my chest. My contemplation was interrupted by the shrill ring of the telephone, my landline, which I maintained despite Preston's repeated offers to upgrade me to a smartphone. Few people called this number anymore. Telemarketing calls had become a rarity, and most of my colleagues had embraced text messaging years ago. "Aunt Eleanor? It's Josephine." I straightened in my chair, surprised. Josephine rarely called except to confirm holiday arrangements or to extend obligatory birthday wishes. "I've just heard about your retirement from Heathcliff. The centennial celebration sounds lovely. We'll all be there, of course." "That's kind of you," I replied, waiting for the real purpose of her call. "The thing is," she continued, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they believe they're being reasonable about something unreasonable, "we've been talking, Preston, Abigail, and I, and we think this is the perfect opportunity for you to make some important changes." "Changes?" I echoed, though I already suspected what was coming. "Your house, Aunt Eleanor. It's so large for just one person, and the upkeep must be exhausting at your age. With the real estate market in Lakeshire as strong as it is, you could sell it for a considerable sum, enough to secure a very comfortable situation at Willowbrook, Gardens, or Cedar Pines. Those are the 2 best retirement communities in the area. I've sent several of my patients there." The presumption was breathtaking. I glanced around my living room with its built-in bookshelves filled with first editions, its antique writing desk where I still paid bills by hand, and the Tiffany lamp that had been Vivian's parting gift to me. This house had been my sanctuary for over 40 years. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm quite content where I am." "Oh, Aunt Eleanor," Josephine sighed, "it's not just about contentment, it's about practicality. What happens if you fall? Those stairs are treacherous and you live alone. No one might find you for days." The fact that she could so casually envision me lying helpless on my own floor should have hurt, but instead, It merely amused me. I had climbed the mountains of Machu Picchu at 75. I practiced yoga 3 times weekly with Madame Juliana, a former Russian ballerina who had reinvented herself as a fitness instructor in her 60s. The likelihood of me falling helplessly was far less than that of Preston tripping over his own inflated ego. I have a life alert system, I informed her mildly, though I had no such thing. And Mrs. Holloway from next door checks on me daily. This at least was true. Iris Holloway, a retired librarian, brought homemade scones every Wednesday and stayed for tea. We were currently working our way through Dickens' complete works, reading aloud to each other in turns. Well, that's something, I suppose, Josephine conceded, sounding disappointed that I had countered her concern so effectively. But still, the maintenance of such an old house, the costs alone must be eating away at your pension. Wouldn't it be nice not to worry about surprise expenses like a new roof or furnace? I smiled to myself, thinking of the comprehensive renovation I had completed just 3 years ago. New copper plumbing, updated electrical, a high-efficiency furnace, and a slate roof guaranteed for a century. The contractor had been Zachariah, Pembroke's son, who offered me a professional courtesy discount in honor of the teacher who had saved his father from a life of mathematical mediocrity, as Zachariah had put it. My house is in excellent condition, I assured her, but I appreciate your concern. We're having dinner next Friday at Bellamy's to celebrate Preston's new partnership, Josephine said, changing tactics. You'll come, won't you? The whole family will be there. The whole family meant my nieces and nephews, their spouses and their children, most of whom viewed me as a quaint oddity, the spinster great-aunt who taught mathematics and collected teacups. The prospect was not enticing, but family obligations ran deep. Of course, I agreed. I look forward to it. After hanging up, I sat for a long while, contemplating the shift that was coming. Retirement had always been an abstract concept, something that happened to other teachers while I continued doing what I loved. Now it loomed just months away, a great unknown territory. The doorbell chimed, interrupting my thoughts. Through the stained glass inset, I could make out a familiar silhouette, tall and angular, with distinctively unruly hair. Ms. Blackwell. The voice that greeted me as I opened the door belonged to Dominic Torres, once my struggling algebra student, now the founder of Equation Nation, an educational technology company valued at over $500 million. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Dominic, I smiled genuinely. What a wonderful surprise. Please come in. He stepped into my foyer, bringing with him the energy that had always characterized him. A vibrating enthusiasm that made him seem perpetually on the verge of discovery. At 45, his black hair was threaded with silver at the temples, but his eyes retained the same keen intelligence I remembered from his teenage years. I was in town for a conference and couldn't leave without seeing you, he explained, following me into the living room. Plus, I heard through the alumni newsletter about the retirement ceremony. 50 years at Heathcliff, it's remarkable. It hardly feels like 50 years, I admitted, settling back into my reading chair while he took the sofa across from me. Though looking at you, all grown up with children of your own, certainly brings the passage of time into focus. He laughed. My oldest, Elena, is starting high school next year. She's brilliant at mathematics, takes after her namesake. He winked, and I felt a rush of affection. I had forgotten that he had named his daughter after me. It was one of the highest compliments a former student could pay. How is your company doing? I asked, though I knew the answer. I had been an early investor in Equation Nation, purchasing shares worth $50,000 when Dominic first took the company public. That investment had multiplied many times over in the decade since. Expanding faster than we can manage, honestly, he admitted. We just secured a contract with the California public school system. Our learning modules will be in every middle school classroom by next fall. That's wonderful, Dominic. You're making mathematics accessible to so many children who might otherwise struggle. His expression grew serious. That's actually why I wanted to see you, Ms. Blackwell. Everything I've accomplished, it all traces back to your classroom. Do you remember when you stayed after school for 6 weeks straight to help me prepare for the state mathematics competition? I nodded. Dominic had been working evenings at his family's restaurant then. He would arrive at my classroom at 7 each morning, exhausted but determined, his textbook dog-eared from late-night studying. My parents wanted me to take over the restaurant, he continued. It was a good, stable business, but you saw something else in me. You convinced them to let me apply for that scholarship to Princeton. You earned that scholarship, Dominic. I merely helped you prepare. He shook his head. You did much more than that. You made me believe I belonged in those university halls. A kid from the east side of Lakeshore, son of immigrants, surrounded by legacy students with summer homes and trust funds. Whenever I doubted myself, I would hear your voice. Mathematics doesn't care where you were born, Dominic. It only cares about the elegance of your solutions. I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through my windows. This was the true wealth I had accumulated over my career. Not the millions in my investment portfolio, but the lives I had touched, the paths I had helped illuminate. I have a proposition for you, Dominic said, leaning forward. Equation Nation is creating a foundation to provide scholarships for underprivileged students showing mathematical promise. We want to name it after you, the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Foundation, and we'd like you to serve as its honorary chairperson. I blinked, genuinely surprised. Dominic, that's incredibly generous. I've already secured initial funding of $10 million, he continued. 5 from the company and 5 from my personal accounts. We'll provide full scholarships to 50 students annually, along with mentorship programs and guaranteed internships. These kids will have opportunities that might otherwise be impossible for them. Emotion threatened to overwhelm me. I had taught thousands of students over my career, but the ones who had stayed with me most vividly were those like Dominic. Bright, minds constrained by circumstance, needing only an open door and someone who believed in them. I would be honored, I said finally, my voice steady despite the tears I felt gathering. On one condition. Name it. I'd like to contribute to the foundation as well. I had been considering my legacy for some time, what to do with my wealth when I was gone. My family would receive portions, of course, but the bulk had been designated for educational causes in my will. Perhaps this was an opportunity to see that legacy in action during my lifetime. Dominic's eyes widened slightly. That's very generous, Ms. Blackwell, but not necessary. Your name and involvement are more than enough. I smiled, recognizing in his response the same assumption that had characterized my family's attitude toward me, that a teacher's contribution would be symbolic rather than substantial. I insist, I said firmly. I'd like to match your personal contribution. He stared at me, confusion evident in his expression. Match my Ms. Blackwell. That would be $5 million. Yes, I agreed simply. I'm aware of the amount. His confusion deepened. But, forgive me, how would you... I've been investing systematically for 50 years, Dominic. Compound interest is a powerful force, as I've told countless students, including you, if I recall your calculus lessons correctly. Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes, followed by something that looked remarkably like delight. You're serious? Entirely. I'll have my financial advisor contact you next week to arrange the details. He laughed then, a bright, surprised sound. Ms. Blackwell, you never cease to amaze me. Here I thought I was coming to offer you a comfortable position on a foundation board, and you're casually matching a $5 million donation. The foundation is a wonderful idea, I told him sincerely, and perfectly timed, given my impending retirement. I'll need something meaningful to occupy my days. We talked for another hour, detailing plans for the foundation, how students would be selected, what support systems would be established, how success would be measured. By the time Dominic left, promising to return with legal documents and a more formal proposal, the afternoon was fading into early evening. I prepared a simple dinner, poached salmon with dill, asparagus from the farmer's market, and a glass of Pinot Grigio. As I ate at my small kitchen table, watching the last light fade from my garden, I considered the day's events. The retirement letter, Josephine's call, Dominic's visit, all converging to mark a transition point in my life. For decades, I had lived two parallel existences: the modest mathematics teacher known to my family and community, and the shrewd investor quietly building wealth. The former had been visible but undervalued, the latter invisible but powerful. Now, as I approached, a new chapter. Perhaps it was time to reconcile these two selves. The dinner at Bellamy's the following Friday loomed in my thoughts. My family would be there in full force, brimming with opinions about how I should manage my retirement and, by extension, the remainder of my life. For 50 years, I had allowed their misconceptions to go unchallenged, finding a certain protection in being underestimated. What would happen if I finally revealed the truth? The question followed me as I washed my dinner dishes, as I watered my collection of African violets on the kitchen windowsill, as I settled into bed with the biography of Katherine Johnson I had been reading. What would change if my family knew the extent of my financial success? Would they see me differently? Would I want them to? The week passed in a flurry of activity. At school, preparations for the end of term intensified. I administered final exams, graded papers, and began the bittersweet process of sorting through 5 decades of accumulated teaching materials. My classroom cabinets yielded forgotten treasures: handmade cards from former students, newspaper clippings of academic achievements, photographs from mathematics competitions dating back to the 1970s. In one dusty folder, I found a stack of thank you notes from the Girls' Mathematics Club I had founded in 1981, when female students were still being subtly discouraged from pursuing advanced mathematics. "Before your class, I thought I wasn't a math person," one student had written. "Now I know that was never true. Thank you for showing me what I'm capable of." These tangible reminders of lives influenced were more precious to me than any financial statement. I set aside the most meaningful items to take home, donating the rest to younger teachers or to the school's archives. At home, I met with Marguerite Chen, my financial advisor of the past 15 years. A no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a genius for tax optimization, Marguerite had taken over my portfolio after Vivian passed away. Under her guidance, my investments had weathered market fluctuations and continued to grow steadily. 5 million is a significant donation, she noted, reviewing the preliminary documents Dominic had sent. But your portfolio can handle it easily, especially given the tax advantages. The foundation is registered as a 501c3, so the contribution will be fully deductible. And my other financial goals? I asked. Will this impact them? She shook her head. Your retirement income stream remains secure. The rental properties continue to perform well. We just renewed the lease on the Meridian Heights duplex at an increased rate, and your equity positions are solid. She smiled slightly. Eleanor, you could donate twice this amount and still live very comfortably for the next 30 years, assuming you suddenly develop expensive tastes. I laughed. That seems unlikely at this point. Which brings me to my usual question, Marguerite said, closing her portfolio. Why maintain this level of secrecy about your finances? Most people in your position would be enjoying their wealth more visibly, traveling, first class, updating their wardrobe, perhaps moving to a more prestigious address. It was a question she asked periodically, never quite understanding my preference for financial privacy and modest living. In truth, the answer was complex, rooted in my upbringing, my observations of wealth's influence on character, and the freedom I found in being underestimated. My needs are simple, I told her, the same answer I always gave. And I prefer to focus my resources on things that matter to me: my home, my garden, occasional travel, and now, this foundation. She nodded, accepting if not fully comprehending. Well, you've certainly mastered the art of stealth wealth. No one would guess from looking at you that you're worth nearly $7 million. That Friday evening, I dressed for dinner at Bellamy's with unusual care. My wardrobe, while not extensive, contained several quality pieces I had acquired over the years. A cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, wool trousers in charcoal gray, a strand of freshwater pearls that had been my mother's. I applied minimal makeup, arranged my silver hair into its usual neat bun, and added small pearl earrings. The reflection that greeted me was that of an elegant older woman, not fashionable in the contemporary sense, but timeless in the way that quality and simplicity often are. I wondered if my family would notice, or if they would see only what they expected to see. Aging Aunt Eleanor in her teacher clothes. Bellamy's occupied the ground floor of what had once been Lakeshire's grandest hotel, now converted into luxury condominiums. The restaurant maintained its old-world charm with dark wood paneling, leather banquettes, and crisp white tablecloths. It was Preston's favorite venue for celebrating his professional achievements, the kind of place where servers knew regular clients by name and never had to be asked twice for anything. The maitre d' greeted me with practiced warmth. "Ms. Blackwell, your party is already seated. Please, allow me to escort you." My family occupied a large round table in the center of the dining room, a strategic location that Preston preferred, allowing him to see and be seen by Lakeshire's elite. Nathaniel and Corinne were there, both in their 80s now, but still impeccably groomed and positioned. Xavier and his third wife, Serena, sat opposite them. My nieces and nephews and their spouses completed the circle, with one empty chair, clearly left for me. Preston rose as I approached, performing the role of gracious host. "Aunt Eleanor, you look lovely this evening." The compliment, while perfunctory, was genuine enough to surprise me. Perhaps the burgundy cashmere had made an impression after all. "Thank you, Preston. Congratulations on your partnership. That's quite an achievement." He beamed, gesturing for me to take the empty seat between Abigail and her husband, Marcus. 38 is somewhat young for partner at Harrington and Stone. The youngest in 15 years, actually. "We were just discussing Preston's new office," Abigail informed me as I settled into my chair. "Corner suite? 20th floor, with views of the lake. They're bringing in custom furniture next week." "How impressive," I murmured, accepting the menu a server discreetly placed before me. The conversation flowed around me, discussions of property values in Oakwood Estates, Josephine's daughter's acceptance to Yale, Xavier's recent acquisition of a vacation property in Santorini. I listened more than I spoke, a pattern established long ago at family gatherings. "Aunt Eleanor," Corinne addressed me directly as the appetizers arrived, "Nathaniel tells me you're finally retiring from teaching. How wonderful for you to have such a long career." The phrasing, "such a long career," carried the subtle implication that duration was my career's primary distinction, rather than impact or accomplishment. "It has been rewarding," I replied, "though I'll miss my students terribly." "I'm sure they'll miss you too," Nathaniel said, his tone carrying the same gentle condescension I had heard since childhood. "You always had a way with young people." "Several of my former students have gone on to remarkable achievements," I offered. "Dominic Torres visited me just last week. He's founded a very successful educational technology company." "Torres," Preston repeated thoughtfully. "Equation Nation, right? They went public about a decade ago, strong performer on the NASDAQ." Yes, that's right, I confirmed, somewhat surprised by his knowledge. Good for him, Nathaniel said dismissively. Though I've never understood the appeal of those computer learning programs. Nothing replaces a proper education with real teachers. The irony of his statement, championing teachers while simultaneously dismissing my career's value, was not lost on me. Speaking of your retirement, Josephine interjected smoothly, have you given any more thought to our discussion about housing options? I took the liberty of collecting some brochures from Willowbrook Gardens. She reached into her handbag and produced several glossy pamphlets. Their waiting list can be quite long, but I spoke with the director. He's a patient of mine, and he assured me they could accommodate you within the next 3 months. I accepted the brochures politely, but left them untouched beside my plate. That's very thoughtful of you, Josephine, but as I mentioned, I'm quite happy in my home. Aunt Eleanor, Preston leaned forward, his expression serious. We're concerned about your financial security. Teachers' pensions are notoriously inadequate, and the cost of maintaining an older home can be substantial, not to mention potential healthcare expenses as you age. Your concern is touching, I replied, taking a deliberate sip of the excellent Chardonnay that accompanied our first course. But I assure you, my finances are in order. But how can they be? Abigail asked bluntly. You've been on a teacher's salary your entire life. What kind of retirement could you possibly have secured? The question hung in the air, blunt in its presumption. Around the table, expressions ranged from Abigail's frank curiosity to Nathaniel's discomfort at her directness to Preston's barely concealed calculation. They were waiting for confirmation of what they already believed, that Aunt Eleanor, the career teacher, must surely be financially vulnerable in her old age. For 50 years, I had allowed this misconception to persist. It had shielded me from certain expectations, certain demands, certain types of attention. It had given me the freedom to live as I chose, to make financial decisions based on my values rather than external pressures. But as I looked around the table at my family, people I had known all their lives, people who had never truly known me, I felt a sudden weariness with the charade. Perhaps it was time for truth. Perhaps, as I entered this new chapter of my life, honesty would serve me better than protective obscurity. Actually, I said quietly, my finances are rather better than you might imagine. Preston smiled indulgently. Aunt Eleanor, we understand you've always been frugal, but even the most careful savings can only stretch so far on a teacher's income. I reached for my handbag, not the one they were accustomed to seeing, my practical leather satchel, but the smaller, more elegant clutch I had chosen for this evening. From it, I withdrew a folded document, my most recent financial statement, prepared by Marguerite for my meeting with Dominic. I had brought it on impulse, half expecting I would never actually share it. Perhaps this will clarify my position, I said, sliding the document across the table to Preston, whose expression of patronizing concern froze as he registered the contents. This can't be accurate, he said finally, his voice hushed. It's entirely accurate, I assured him. Updated as of last week. What is it? Nathaniel demanded, reaching for the statement. His eyes widened as he scanned the figures. Eleanor, is this some kind of joke? I assure you it's not, I replied calmly. I've been investing consistently since my 20s. As I often told my students, compound interest is a powerful force when given sufficient time. The statement made its way around the table, expressions of shock rippling in its wake. Corinne actually gasped audibly when she saw the total. Xavier studied it with professional intensity, looking for some error or misinterpretation. $6.7 million, Abigail breathed, the last to see the document. Aunt Eleanor, how is this possible? I took another sip of wine, feeling strangely calm as 50 years of carefully maintained privacy dissolved around me. It's actually rather simple mathematics. I began investing 15% of every paycheck when I was 25, guided by my mentor, Vivian Reynolds. As my salary increased, so did my investment percentage. I lived modestly, avoided debt, and made consistent, informed choices. The rest is just time and patience. But you've always lived so. Josephine struggled to find a diplomatic term. Simply? I offered. By choice, not necessity. My needs are modest. I derive far more pleasure from a good book than from luxury goods. Does this mean you don't need to sell your house? Preston asked, his tone suggesting this was the most pressing concern raised by my revelation. I laughed softly. No, Preston, I don't need to sell my house. In fact, I own it outright, along with 4 other properties in Lakeshore and Meridian Heights. I've been a landlord since 1984. Why didn't you ever tell us? Nathaniel demanded, a hint of accusation in his voice. It was the question I had anticipated, yet found difficult to answer succinctly. How could I explain that their dismissal of my career, their lifelong condescension, had created a gulf that made genuine sharing impossible? How could I articulate that their values, so centered on visible wealth and status, were fundamentally at odds with my own? Would you have believed me? I asked finally. Or would you have assumed I was confused about my own finances? More importantly, would it have changed how you saw me, not as a person, but as a resource? The table fell silent. In that moment, I saw my brother and his children clearly, not as the successful, entitled adults they had become, but as people who had been taught to value the wrong things. They had been raised to equate worth with wealth, to measure success in square footage and luxury brands, and yet, here I was, wealthy beyond their imagination, having lived a life they had dismissed as insignificant. I don't need Willowbrook Gardens, I said, breaking the awkward silence. And when the time comes that I can no longer live independently, I've already made arrangements that don't involve assisted living, but thank you for your concern. The server arrived with our main courses, creating a welcome diversion. Conversation resumed haltingly, focusing on safer topics: the weather, Josephine's daughter's college plans, the renovation of the Lakeshore Public Library. As dessert was served, a chocolate soufflé that was Bellamy's signature offering, Preston approached me privately while others were engaged in conversation. Aunt Eleanor, he began, his voice softer than I had heard it in years. I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been condescending. Yes, I agreed simply. He laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. All these years I thought I understood finance. I never imagined you were quietly outperforming most professional investors. That's the problem with assumptions, Preston. They limit our vision. He studied me with new eyes, not the indulgent gaze reserved for an elderly relative, but the appraising look of one professional assessing another. I'd be interested in hearing about your investment strategy sometime. Perhaps we could have lunch? I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with the sincerity of my response. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Nathaniel approached me, his expression troubled. Eleanor, I feel I should apologize as well. It seems I've underestimated you all these years. It's a common misconception, I assured him, that teaching is merely a calling rather than a profession, and that those who choose it must necessarily sacrifice financial security. He nodded slowly. Still, as your brother, I should have known you better. There was regret in his voice, genuine, if belated. I thought of all the years we had missed, the meaningful conversations we had never had, the mutual respect that might have developed had he seen me clearly from the beginning. Perhaps it's not too late to rectify that, I suggested. His smile was tentative but real. I'd like that very much. As I drove home to my modest house on Hawthorne Drive, I reflected on the evening's revelations. The family dynamic had shifted, perhaps permanently. My nieces and nephews would never again view me as the pitiable spinster aunt in need of their guidance and management. My brothers would never again dismiss my career as merely noble rather than valuable. There was satisfaction in that revelation, but also a certain melancholy for the years of genuine connection we had missed. Still, I reminded myself as I turned onto my familiar street, it's never too late to teach or to learn an important lesson. Tomorrow would bring new activities, planning for the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Foundation with Dominic, preparing for my retirement ceremony, perhaps even researching that trip to New Zealand I had always wanted to take. At 78, my life was far from over. In many ways, it was expanding in directions I had never anticipated. The garden needed attention, the azaleas were about to bloom, and the vegetable beds required preparation for summer planting. There were books waiting on my nightstand, a financial literacy workshop to plan for next week, and friends coming for Sunday brunch. My life was full in ways my family was only beginning to comprehend. And for the first time in 50 years, I was moving forward without the weight of their misconceptions. It felt, rather unexpectedly, like freedom. The morning after the Bellamy's dinner revelation, I woke to sunshine streaming through my bedroom curtains and an unusual sense of lightness. For decades, I had carried the weight of my financial secret, protecting it from family scrutiny and societal expectations. Now that burden had been lifted, leaving me with an unexpected question. Who was Eleanor Blackwell without her carefully constructed facade? I followed my usual morning routine, stretching exercises learned from Madame Juliana, a light breakfast of steel-cut oats with fresh berries, and strong black tea in my favorite Wedgwood cup. The normality was comforting, even as I felt the ground shifting beneath me. My telephone remained mercifully silent. No doubt my family was still processing last night's revelations, perhaps conferring among themselves about this new version of Aunt Eleanor, who had suddenly emerged. By mid-morning, I had settled in my garden with a stack of final exams to grade. The mathematics of 12th grade calculus was a welcome respite from emotional complexity. Equations that balanced perfectly. Problems with definitive solutions. I was halfway through the stack when I heard the distinctive crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. Through the lilac hedge, I glimpsed Josephine's silver Mercedes. She emerged looking uncharacteristically uncertain, clutching what appeared to be a small gift bag. I set aside my papers and rose to greet her. "Aunt Eleanor," she called, spotting me among the garden beds. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important?" "Just grading exams," I replied, gesturing toward the patio chairs. "Would you care to join me?" I was about to take a break. She settled into a wrought iron chair, carefully arranging her designer sundress. Josephine had always been the most image-conscious of my nieces, her appearance meticulously curated for her role as Lakeshire's premier dermatologist to the elite. "I brought you something," she said, extending the gift bag. A small apology for my presumption. Inside, I found an elegant teacup and saucer in bone china, hand-painted with delicate purple irises, my favorite flower. It was thoughtful and surprisingly personal, suggesting she knew more about my preferences than I had realized. "It's lovely," I said sincerely. "Thank you, Josephine." She smiled, seeming relieved. "I saw it at Harrington's Antiques last month and thought of you immediately. I've been saving it for your birthday, but after last night." She trailed off, clearly uncertain how to address the dramatic shift in our relationship. "Last night was illuminating for all of us, I think," I offered, giving her an opening. "Aunt Eleanor," she began, then paused to gather her thoughts. "I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been making assumptions about your life, your finances, your capabilities, your needs, without ever truly asking you. It was patronizing. And, frankly, embarrassing in retrospect." The admission surprised me with its directness. Of my 3 nieces and nephews, Josephine had always struck me as the least introspective, the most concerned with appearances rather than substance. I appreciate your candor, I told her. Though I bear some responsibility as well. I deliberately maintained certain misconceptions about my circumstances. But why? She asked, genuine puzzlement in her expression. Why let us believe you were struggling financially when you weren't? It was a fair question, one I had never fully articulated even to myself. I considered my answer carefully. There's a certain freedom in being underestimated, I said finally. When people believe you have little, they expect little from you. They make fewer demands. They don't view you as a resource to be leveraged or an advantage to be gained. Josephine's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that how you see us? As people who would try to leverage you for financial gain? Not consciously, perhaps, I allowed. But wealth changes how people perceive you. It alters expectations and interactions in subtle ways. I've observed it throughout my life, with your father and uncle, with my wealthy students' parents, with donors to Heathcliff Academy. Money creates a particular lens through which others view you. She nodded slowly, absorbing this. I suppose I've never thought about it from that perspective. I've always had money, or at least access to it, through family. I've never known what it's like to be perceived as lacking. It's quite educational, I said with a small smile. You learn who values you for yourself rather than for what you can provide. Josephine looked troubled by this observation. And we failed that test rather spectacularly, didn't we? Especially recently, with all the retirement home suggestions. You were concerned about my welfare, I acknowledged, though perhaps not entirely attuned to my preferences. She laughed softly. That's a very generous interpretation. The truth is, we were being controlling, under the guise of care. Dad. And Uncle Xavier always treated you that way, as if you needed guidance and protection rather than respect. And we absorbed that attitude without questioning it. She paused, looking out over my carefully tended garden. It must have been infuriating. At times, I admitted, though I found ways to create the life I wanted, regardless of family expectations. That's what I can't stop thinking about, Josephine said, turning back to me with newfound respect in her eyes. You built this extraordinary financial foundation completely independently, while pursuing a career you loved, all while we were. What? Patronizing you? Pitying you? She shook her head. It's humbling, Aunt Eleanor. I had excellent guidance, I told her. My mentor, Vivian Reynolds, set me on this path when I was your age. And I had the benefit of time. 50 years of consistent investing creates rather impressive results. Even so, it requires discipline and vision. Preston spent half the night researching historical market returns, trying to reverse engineer your investment strategy. He's completely baffled by how you achieved those returns without professional management. I smiled, thinking of Preston's probable frustration. Perhaps he'd like to join us for tea sometime. I'm happy to discuss investment philosophy. He'd love that, Josephine said, then hesitated. Actually, that brings me to another reason for my visit. We're having a family brunch on Sunday, just immediate family, nothing formal. Would you join us? Everyone is eager to, well, to get to know you properly. The real you, not the version we've constructed in our minds. The invitation touched me unexpectedly. For decades, family gatherings had been obligations to endure rather than occasions to anticipate. The prospect of a different dynamic was both appealing and slightly unnerving. I'd be delighted, I told her sincerely. After Josephine left, I returned to my grading, but found my thoughts drifting to Sunday's brunch and what it might represent, i.e., potential reconciliation, a new chapter in my relationship with my family. I had never imagined that financial disclosure would be the bridge spanning decades of misunderstanding, yet perhaps it was fitting. Money had always been the lens through which my family viewed success. Now that they saw me as financially accomplished, they were finally ready to see me. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I chose not to dwell on it. At 78, I had learned to accept people as they were, to find connection where possible, without expecting transformation. If my newfound financial status opened a door to genuine relationship with my family, I would step through it gratefully, regardless of what had kept it closed for so long. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of end-of-term activities at Heathcliff. Final exams were completed, grades submitted, and classroom materials packed away. Each task carried additional emotional weight, knowing it would be the last time I performed these familiar rituals as a teacher. Colleagues stopped by my classroom with well wishes and reminiscences. Students, sensing the historical significance of my departure, asked for photographs and advice. Ms. Blackwell, Miranda Chen, one of my brightest calculus students, approached my desk after the final bell on Friday. "I wanted to ask you something before you leave." "Of course, Miranda. What can I help you with?" She fidgeted with the strap of her backpack. "I got accepted to both MIT and Stanford for mathematics. Everyone says MIT is the better program, but I'm not sure it's right for me. My parents are pushing for it, though." I considered her situation carefully. Miranda reminded me of myself, at her age, brilliant with numbers, somewhat reserved socially, and under considerable family pressure. "What draws you to Stanford?" I asked. "Their interdisciplinary approach," she replied immediately. "I'm interested in mathematical applications to environmental science, and Stanford has an amazing program that bridges those fields. But my parents say pure mathematics at MIT will give me more career options." I smiled, remembering similar conversations from decades past. "You know, Miranda, there's an interesting parallel between education and investing." She looked confused by the apparent non sequitur. "Investing? Indeed. In both cases, the most successful long-term strategy is to invest in what you truly value, not what others tell you to value. I've watched generations of students choose paths to please parents or impress peers, only to find themselves unfulfilled, years later." I leaned forward slightly. "Where do you imagine yourself most engaged? Most intellectually alive? That's your MIT or Stanford answer." Miranda's expression cleared. "Stanford. Definitely Stanford." "Then perhaps that's your answer. Your parents want what's best for you, but only you can determine what best means in the context of your specific gifts and interests." She nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Ms. Blackwell. That helps a lot." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "We're all going to miss you so much. You've been the best teacher I've ever had." The simple sincerity of her statement affected me more than any formal recognition. "Thank you, Miranda. Students like you have made these 50 years profoundly rewarding." After she left, I sat alone in my classroom, absorbing the silence that would soon become permanent. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, illuminating decades of mathematics taught within these walls. I had begun my career when slide rules were still in use. Witness the introduction of electronic calculators, then graphing calculators, then computer algebra systems. Through it all, the essential joy remained constant. The moment when understanding dawned in a student's eyes, when abstract concepts became concrete tools for interpreting the world. Would I miss this? Undoubtedly. But as Vivian had wisely counseled me years ago, endings create space for new beginnings. The Eleanor Blackwell. Mathematics Foundation awaited my attention. The freedom of retirement stretched before me with both challenge and promise. I was gathering my belongings when Headmaster Wellington appeared in the doorway. Thaddeus Wellington had been at Heathcliff for only 15 years, a relative newcomer by my standards, but he had proven to be a thoughtful administrator with genuine respect for the school's traditions and faculty. "Eleanor," he greeted me warmly. I've just come from a board meeting where your retirement gift was finalized. I thought you might like to hear about it privately, before the centennial celebration. That's very considerate, Thaddeus. Please, come in. He settled into a student desk opposite mine, looking somewhat awkward with his long legs folded into the confined space. The board was unanimous in their decision to establish the Eleanor Blackwell Excellence in Mathematics Award, an annual scholarship for a Heathcliff senior demonstrating exceptional mathematical ability and planning to pursue the field at university level. That's a lovely gesture, I said, genuinely touched. Thank you. There's more, he continued, looking pleased. The initial endowment will be $50,000, $1,000 for each year of your service. The scholarship will provide $5,000 annually to the recipient. I did the calculation automatically. That would only sustain the scholarship for 10 years. Wellington smiled. Yes, we're hoping to grow the endowment through alumni contributions, which brings me to a rather delicate question. He hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Several board members suggested approaching you directly about contributing to the endowment, given your apparent financial acumen. I raised an eyebrow, surprised by this development. My financial acumen? He shifted uncomfortably. Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but Dominic Torres mentioned the foundation you're establishing together. $5 million is a significant contribution which suggests, well, it suggests resources beyond what most might assume for a career educator. News traveled quickly in Lakeshire, particularly among the philanthropic circuit where Dominic was a recognized figure. I wasn't entirely surprised that Wellington had heard about the foundation, though I was mildly annoyed by the presumption. I see, I said neutrally, giving him no assistance in this awkward conversation. Of course, there's absolutely no pressure, he added hastily. The board was merely curious whether you might be interested in supporting the scholarship that bears your name. I considered the request. Unlike my family's assumptions about my finances, which had been based on stereotypes rather than facts, this approach was at least direct. And I did value mathematics education deeply. I would be happy to match the board's commitment, I decided. $50,000 now, with the possibility of further contributions in the future, depending on how the program develops. Wellington's eyebrows rose slightly. That's extraordinarily generous, Eleanor. The board will be delighted. With one condition, I added. Of course. What condition? The scholarship must include specific consideration for female students and those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Mathematics has traditionally created barriers for both groups. I'd like this scholarship to help dismantle those barriers. Wellington nodded thoughtfully. A worthy goal, and entirely consistent with our diversity initiatives. I'll ensure that language is incorporated into the scholarship criteria. After he left, I finished gathering my belongings. The personal items that had made this classroom uniquely mine over 5 decades. A crystal paperweight gifted by the class of '85. Framed photographs of mathematics competition teams I had coached to state championships. The antique slide rule that had belonged to my grandfather, displayed on my desk as a conversation piece, for students who had never seen such an instrument. Each object carried memories, connections to young people who had passed through this room and moved on to their adult lives. I packed them carefully, acknowledging the bitter sweetness of this transition. 50 years of teaching had shaped me in ways both visible and invisible. Who would I be without this daily purpose, this familiar identity? The question followed me home, where I found a package waiting on my doorstep, a delivery from Marguerite, Chen containing documents for the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Foundation. Inside were legal forms requiring signatures, financial projections for the endowment, and draft bylaws for the foundation's operation. I settled at my writing desk to review the materials, making notes where changes seemed appropriate. The foundation's mission statement in particular needed refinement, to identify and nurture mathematical talent in underserved communities. to identify, nurture, and empower mathematical talent in underserved communities, I amended, adding, providing not only financial support but mentorship, enrichment opportunities, and pathways to advanced education and careers in mathematics and related fields. This work absorbed me for several hours, the complexity of establishing a foundation providing welcome intellectual engagement. By the time I completed my review, evening had arrived. I prepared a simple dinner, a spinach salad with grilled chicken and a glass of Pinot Noir, and carried it to my reading room, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves housed my extensive collection of mathematics texts, literature, and biography. My evening ritual typically included reading, perhaps some classical music, and occasionally correspondence with former students or colleagues. Tonight, however, my attention was drawn to a leather-bound journal on the higher shelf, Vivian Reynolds's investment diary, which she had gifted me shortly before her death. I retrieved it carefully, settling back into my armchair with this tangible connection to my mentor. The journal contained Vivian's observations on markets and investments spanning 4 decades, from 1943 to 1983. Her neat, precise handwriting documented not just transactions but philosophy, the principles that had guided her financial decisions and, by extension, helped shape mine. "The market is driven by fear and greed," she had written in 1962, "but the successful investor is driven by patience and reason. When others panic, stand firm. When others are euphoric, exercise caution. Time in the market always outperforms timing the market." Her wisdom had served me well over my own 5 decades of investing. I had weathered market crashes, recessions, bubbles, and booms by adhering to her foundational principles. Invest consistently, diversify sensibly, reinvest dividends, minimize fees, and maintain a long-term perspective regardless of short-term volatility. As I turned the pages of Vivian's journal, I found myself reflecting on the parallels between teaching and investing, both requiring patience, discipline, and faith in future returns that couldn't be immediately measured. Both involving the careful cultivation of potential, both demanding a certain humility before forces larger than oneself. Perhaps that was why I had excelled at both. The same temperament that allowed me to invest methodically for decades without seeking validation or immediate gratification had suited me to teaching adolescents, planting seeds of knowledge that might not flower for years, sometimes decades. The doorbell interrupted my reflections. Through the stained glass panels flanking my front door, I could make out a familiar silhouette, Xavier, my younger brother, whom I hadn't seen alone in years. Our interactions were typically limited to family gatherings where his gregarious personality dominated conversations. "Eleanor," he greeted me as I opened the door, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "Not at all," I assured him, genuinely curious about this unexpected visit. "Please, come in." Xavier had aged well, his once dark hair now silver but still abundant, his posture still erect despite approaching 80. He followed me to the living room, declining my offer of tea or wine with a distracted wave. "I'll be direct, Eleanor," he said, settling onto my sofa. "I've come to apologize. Last night at Bellamy's, I realized I've never really known my own sister. Not truly, and that's entirely my failing." His candor surprised me. Xavier had always been the confident one, the charming one, the brother who moved through life with the ease of someone who assumed the world was designed for his comfort and success. "We've both lived busy lives," I offered, giving him an easy opening. He shook his head firmly. "No, that's too simple. The truth is, I dismissed you, Eleanor. I categorized you as the sensible, unambitious sister who chose a conventional path. I never bothered to look deeper because I assumed there was nothing more to see." He met my gaze directly. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology touched me more deeply than I had anticipated. perhaps because it came from Xavier, who had rarely acknowledged error in his long and successful life. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a great deal." He glanced around my living room, seeming to truly see it for the first time. The quality furnishings I had acquired piece by piece over decades, the original artwork from local artists I had supported, the carefully curated bookshelves reflecting my diverse interests. "You've created a beautiful home," he observed. "I never really noticed before. I was too busy feeling sorry for you, living alone in what I assumed was all you could afford." "Assumptions can be limiting," I agreed mildly. "Indeed." He hesitated, then continued with unusual sincerity. "What amazes me most isn't just your financial success, impressive though it is. It's that you achieved it while doing work you genuinely loved, while creating meaning and impact. I've been turning that over in my mind since last night." "And what have you concluded?" I asked, curious about this introspective version of my normally extroverted brother. "That I may have optimized for the wrong variables," he admitted. "I built wealth and status, certainly. But meaning? Impact? Those have been more elusive." He smiled ruefully. 3 marriages and several estranged children suggest I haven't managed the truly important aspects of life particularly well." It was perhaps the most honest conversation we had ever had. Xavier had always presented a carefully curated image of success, even in private family settings. This vulnerability was new territory. "It's never too late to shift priorities," I suggested gently. "Perhaps not." He straightened slightly, seemingly uncomfortable with extended vulnerability. "Actually, that brings me to the second reason for my visit. I've been thinking about your foundation, the one Dominic Torres mentioned to Nathaniel. It sounds like important work." "It is," I confirmed. "We're focusing on identifying mathematical talent in underserved communities, providing both financial support and enrichment opportunities." "I'd like to contribute," he said decisively. $5 million to match your commitment." The offer stunned me. While Xavier had made the obligatory charitable contributions expected of someone in his position, he had never shown particular interest in educational causes. "That's extremely generous," I said carefully. "But may I ask why? This isn't an area you've previously supported." He considered the question seriously. "2 reasons. First, it clearly matters to you, and I'd like to support something that has meaning for my sister. Second." He paused, choosing his words with uncharacteristic precision. "I've spent decades accumulating wealth. I'm beginning to realize I should give more thought to its purpose. Perhaps supporting the next generation of mathematical minds is a worthwhile legacy. Better than another vacation property or luxury car." I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Xavier had always been charming, capable of saying whatever would advance his interests in the moment. But there seemed to be genuine reflection behind his words tonight. "The foundation would be grateful for your support," I said finally. "But I'd suggest starting with a smaller commitment, perhaps $1 million initially. If you find the work continues to resonate with you after a year or 2, you could consider increasing your involvement." He looked momentarily surprised by my cautious response, then laughed. "Always the sensible one, aren't you, Eleanor?" "Very well, $1 million to start. I'll have my office prepare the transfer next week." As he rose to leave, Xavier paused, looking around my living room once more. "You know, I've been wondering, with your means, you could have lived anywhere, in any style. Why did you choose to stay in Lakeshire, in this house?" The question revealed how fundamentally he had misunderstood my values, even now. "Because this is home," I said simply. "I love this house, this garden, this community. My wealth was never about acquiring status symbols or demonstrating success to others. It was about creating freedom and security to live exactly as I chose." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. I'm starting to understand that about you, Eleanor. Better late than never, I suppose. After Xavier left, I returned to my reading room, picking up Vivian's journal from where I had set it aside. One entry from 1975 caught my eye. True wealth is not measured by what you can buy, but by what you can afford not to sell. Your time, your principles, your peace of mind. Vivian had lived that philosophy, teaching mathematics because she loved it, investing wisely to create freedom rather than ostentation. I had followed her example, finding profound satisfaction in a life that appeared modest to observers but felt abundantly rich from within. Now, approaching retirement, I wondered what new freedoms awaited me. The foundation would provide purpose and connection to the field I loved. My financial security would allow me to travel, to pursue interests, to continue living independently in my beloved home, and perhaps, unexpectedly, I might develop new relationships with my family, connections based on genuine understanding rather than misplaced assumptions. Sunday's brunch loomed in my thoughts, the first family gathering since my revelation. At Bellamy's. Would the newfound respect from Josephine and Xavier extend to the rest of the family? Would Nathaniel, always the most traditional and judgmental, revise his lifelong perception of his sensible sister? Would my great-nieces and nephews, who had barely acknowledged my existence at previous gatherings, suddenly discover an interest in their wealthy great-aunt? The cynical part of me expected exactly that. Attention based on financial status rather than personal connection. But perhaps that was unfair. People could surprise you, as Xavier had tonight. Relationships could evolve, even after decades of established patterns. I closed Vivian's journal and replaced it carefully on its shelf. Tomorrow would bring the final faculty meeting of the term, more preparation for the centennial celebration, and a visit from Dominic to finalize foundation details. Sunday would bring family brunch with all its attendant complexities. But tonight, in the quiet of my reading room with a half-finished glass of wine and the satisfaction of a life well lived, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had created this life brick by brick, choice by choice, over 5 decades. Whatever came next would be built on that solid foundation. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for my final faculty meeting at Heathcliff Academy. I dressed with particular care in a tailored charcoal suit and silk blouse, professional attire that I had always favored for important school occasions. My mother's pearls completed the ensemble, a touch of sentiment on this milestone day. The faculty lounge was already crowded when I arrived. Colleagues from all departments had gathered for this end-of-term meeting, with the usual clusters forming. Science teachers near the coffee station, humanities faculty by the windows, younger teachers checking phones while older ones exchanged summer plans. Eleanor, Margaret Winters, the English department chair, and my closest friend at Heathcliff waved me over. At 62, Margaret was 16 years my junior, but had become a valued confidant during her 25 years at the school. "I saved you a seat. Rumor has it Wellington has a special announcement today about the scholarship," I confirmed, settling beside her. Though it was supposed to remain confidential until the centennial celebration. Margaret's eyebrows rose. Scholarship? I hadn't heard about that. The rumor mill suggested something about a major donation from an alumnus. Dominic Torres, perhaps. He's been spotted on campus several times recently. "Ah," I said noncommittally, unwilling to reveal too much about the foundation before it was officially announced. "We'll know soon enough, I expect." "Headmaster." Wellington called the meeting to order promptly at 9, beginning with the usual end-of-term business: summer maintenance schedules, curriculum committee reports, enrollment projections for the fall. I listened with half attention, my mind alternating between nostalgia for these familiar proceedings and anticipation of freedom from them. "Finally," Wellington said, concluding the administrative portion, "I have 2 special announcements regarding our upcoming centennial celebration, and Ms. Blackwell's retirement. The room quieted, attention focusing on me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. After 50 years, I was something of an institution myself at Heathcliff, the living link to the school's earlier history. First, the board has approved the establishment of the Eleanor Blackwell Excellence in Mathematics Award, an annual scholarship for a graduating senior demonstrating exceptional mathematical ability and planning to pursue the field at university level. The initial endowment will be $100,000, providing a $5,000 scholarship annually. Surprised murmurs spread through the faculty. Wellington had mentioned $50,000 from the board the previous day, with my matching contribution. The additional $50,000 was unexpected. The board's initial commitment of $50,000 has been generously matched by Ms. Blackwell herself, Wellington continued, with an additional $50,000 contributed anonymously by a member of the Heathcliff community who wishes to honor Ms. Blackwell's 5 decades of service. I glanced at Margaret, who was watching me with newfound curiosity. The anonymous donor was a mystery to me as well, perhaps a former student, or a parent grateful for my influence on their child. Second, Wellington said, I'm delighted to announce a major new initiative that will enhance Heathcliff Academy's commitment to mathematical excellence and educational equity. Dominic Torres, class of '89, has partnered with Ms. Blackwell to establish the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Foundation, which will identify and support mathematically talented students from underserved communities. The announcement was met with genuine applause. Dominic's success was well known among the faculty, many of whom remembered him as a student. His connection to me was also familiar. I had never hidden my pride in his accomplishments. The foundation launches with an initial endowment of $11 million, Wellington continued, with Mr. Torres and Ms. Blackwell as founding donors. This represents one of the largest educational philanthropic initiatives in Lakeshire's history. The applause faltered slightly as confusion spread through the room. Wellington's wording clearly implied that I was a major donor to this foundation, an unexpected revelation for colleagues who had known me for decades as a dedicated but modestly compensated teacher. Margaret leaned close, whispering, Eleanor, did I hear that correctly? You're a founding donor alongside Dominic Torres? I nodded slightly, watching realization dawn in her eyes. But that would mean, she began, then stopped, mathematical calculations clearly running through her mind. Eleanor Blackwell, you dark horse. Have you been secretly wealthy all this time? Not secretly, I corrected quietly, just privately. Further discussion was forestalled as Wellington concluded the meeting with logistical details for the centennial celebration. As faculty members dispersed, several colleagues approached to congratulate me on both the scholarship and the foundation. Their expressions held varying degrees of surprise and reassessment, the same adjustment I had witnessed in my family's responses at Bellamy's. I knew you were smart about money, Douglas Chen from the physics department commented. But this is a whole different level. Partnering with Dominic Torres on a multi-million-dollar foundation? That's impressive, Eleanor. Dominic was my student, I reminded him mildly. The foundation was his initiative. Still, Douglas persisted, to contribute at that level. I mean, we're all teachers here. We know the salary scale. I smiled non-committally, unwilling to explain my 5 decades of investment strategy in the faculty lounge. Careful planning makes many things possible, Douglas. Margaret, who had been observing these exchanges, with keen interest, linked her arm through mine as we left the meeting. Lunch, she said decisively. You and me. Today. And I expect the full story. Eleanor Blackwell. I laughed, genuinely pleased by her directness. Unlike my family, whose interest seemed inextricably linked to my newfound financial status, Margaret's curiosity felt like simple friendship, the desire to know me more completely after 25 years of collegiality. Lunch it is, I agreed. But you're buying. After all, I have to conserve my resources for philanthropy. Her surprised laughter echoed through the hallway as we headed toward our respective classrooms for the final time that term, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in a story still unfolding after 50 years. Sunday morning arrived with unexpected anxiety fluttering in my chest. Family brunch at Nathaniel's home, once an obligation to be endured, now felt like stepping onto unfamiliar terrain. How would they see me today? More importantly, how would I see myself in their presence? No longer the pitied spinster aunt, but a woman whose financial acumen had earned their belated respect. I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A sage, green linen dress I had purchased in London during my last European trip, paired with a simple pearl pendant and earrings that had been my mother's. Neither ostentatious nor apologetically modest, simply appropriate for a spring brunch with family. As I drove through Lakeshore's tree-lined streets toward Oakwood Estates, I rehearsed potential conversations in my mind. Questions would inevitably arise about my investments, my foundation with Dominic, my plans for retirement. Where once I had deflected personal inquiries with practiced vagueness, now I needed to decide how much of myself to reveal, how much to withhold. Nathaniel's Tudor-style home dominated its corner lot, freshly painted shutters complementing manicured landscaping that announced prosperity without shouting it. Corinne had always had impeccable taste, I acknowledged as I pulled into the circular driveway behind Josephine's Mercedes. Some things, at least, remained predictable. The door opened before I could ring the bell. Nathaniel stood there, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Eleanor," he greeted me, his voice warmer than usual. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." The formality in his tone suggested discomfort, which wasn't entirely surprising. My older brother had spent decades relating to me through a particular lens. His sensible, somewhat pitiable sister who had chosen teaching over marriage, modest security over ambition. Now that lens had been shattered, and he was clearly struggling to find appropriate focus. The dining room had been set for brunch with Corinne's best china and silver, fresh flowers arranged in the center of the table. My nieces and nephews were already seated with their spouses, mimosas in hand. The conversation hushed momentarily as I entered, then resumed with a slightly forced quality. "Aunt Eleanor," Preston rose to greet me, pulling out a chair next to his. "We saved you a seat of honor. Can I get you a mimosa?" "Thank you, Preston." I accepted the chair but waved away the offered drink. "Just orange juice for me, please." As Preston moved toward the sideboard, I caught Abigail watching me with undisguised curiosity. "That's a lovely dress, Aunt Eleanor. Is it new?" 3 years old, actually, I replied mildly. "From a small boutique in Covent Garden." "You've been to London?" she asked, genuine surprise in her voice. The question highlighted how little they knew of my life outside family gatherings. "Several times. I particularly enjoy the theater there. My last trip included performances at the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre." "I had no idea you were interested in theater," Corinne commented, joining the conversation as she supervised the placement of serving dishes by their longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Harrington. "There's rather a lot we don't know about Aunt Eleanor, it seems," Josephine said with a pointed glance around the table. "Perhaps today is a good opportunity to remedy that." Nathaniel cleared his throat, assuming the patriarch's role as everyone, settled into their seats. "Indeed. But first, I'd like to say how pleased we are that Eleanor could join us today. Recent revelations aside, we're simply glad to have family together." It was a gracious opening, allowing everyone to acknowledge the elephant in the room without making it the immediate focus. I appreciated the gesture, particularly from Nathaniel, who had never been known for emotional intelligence. Brunch proceeded with the passing of quiche, fresh fruit, pastries, and smoked salmon. The initial awkwardness gradually dissipated as Conversation turned to familiar topics: Preston's children's summer plans, Abigail's involvement with the Lakeshore Arts Council, Josephine's medical practice. I participated more than usual, asking follow-up questions and offering occasional observations. Where once I had retreated into quiet observation at family gatherings, now I found myself genuinely curious about these relatives who were viewing me with new eyes. Eventually, as the meal wound down and coffee was served, Preston broached the subject that had clearly been on everyone's mind. "Aunt Eleanor," he began, setting down his cup with deliberate care, "I hope you won't mind my asking, but I've been thinking about your investment strategy since dinner at Bellamy's. Would you be willing to share some insights? From one financial professional to another?" The question was posed respectfully, with none of the condescension that had characterized Preston's previous interactions with me. Still, I considered my response carefully. "What specifically interests you, Preston?" He leaned forward slightly, professional curiosity evident in his expression. "Your returns are exceptional by any standard. Even accounting for 50 years of compound growth, you've significantly outperformed market averages. I'm wondering about your asset allocation, rebalancing approach, and whether you utilized alternative investments." "Preston," Abigail chided, gently, "this is hardly the time for a financial seminar." "On the contrary," I interjected, "I don't mind discussing it." I turned back to Preston. "My approach has been remarkably consistent and considerably less sophisticated than you might imagine. I began with a simple principle taught to me by my mentor: buy quality and hold it. The market rewards patience above all else." Preston nodded, encouraging me to continue. "Initially, I invested in companies I understood, firms with strong fundamentals, ethical leadership, and products or services with enduring value. As my knowledge expanded, I diversified internationally and across sectors, but always maintained that core philosophy. I never attempted to time the market, never panic sold during downturns, and reinvested all dividends automatically." "That's sound but conventional wisdom," Preston observed. "Yet your results are anything but conventional." I smiled slightly. Perhaps the unconventional aspect was behavioral rather than strategic. While others reacted emotionally to market volatility, I simply continued my systematic approach. I lived well below my means, which allowed me to invest a substantial percentage of my income consistently. And I had the advantage of time: 50 years of uninterrupted compounding without early withdrawals for life emergencies or luxuries. "No financial advisor?" Josephine asked, seeming surprised. "Not initially. Vivian Reynolds guided me for the first decade. After her passing, I managed my own investments until about 15 years ago, when the portfolio reached a size that justified professional management. Since then, I've worked with Marguerite Chen at Vanguard Wealth." Preston's eyebrows rose slightly. "Chen is highly respected. Her client minimum is usually 10 million. "We have history," I said simply, not elaborating on the fact that Marguerite had been my calculus student in the class of '97 before pursuing finance at Princeton. She had sought me out when she returned to Lakeshore to establish her practice, remembering my occasional classroom discussions of investment principles. "What? About real estate?" Xavier inquired, entering the conversation for the first time. "You mentioned owning several properties." "4 currently. I began with a duplex in Meridian Heights in 1984, reinvesting the rental income into additional properties over time. Real estate provided both portfolio diversification and reliable income, particularly valuable during market downturns." As coffee cups were refilled, the conversation shifted from investment strategy to the foundation I was establishing with Dominic. Nathaniel, who had remained largely silent during the financial discussion, finally engaged. "Tell us more about this mathematics foundation, Eleanor. It sounds like a significant undertaking for someone entering retirement." I detected genuine interest beneath his measured tone. It's an initiative close to my heart, I acknowledged. Throughout my teaching career, I've encountered extraordinary mathematical talent in students who lacked the resources or opportunities to develop their abilities fully. The Foundation aims to identify such students early and provide comprehensive support, financial assistance certainly, but also enrichment programs, mentorship, and pathways to advanced education. Why mathematics specifically? Corinne asked. Wouldn't a more general educational foundation have broader impact? It was a reasonable question, though it revealed how little she understood my passion for my field. Mathematics is the language of science, technology, engineering, virtually every field driving innovation in our world. Yet mathematical talent is often overlooked or underdeveloped, particularly in resource-limited educational environments. By focusing specifically on mathematics, we can address a critical gap while playing to my expertise. And Dominic Torres approached you with this concept? Nathaniel asked. Yes. He credits his own success partly to the mathematical foundation he received at Heathcliff, and particularly to the additional support I provided during his time there. The foundation represents his way of extending similar opportunities to students who might otherwise be overlooked. It's remarkable that he remembered you so specifically after all these years, Corinne commented, her tone suggesting she found this surprising. I smiled, recognizing the implicit assumption that a teacher's influence would naturally fade with time. Teachers often plant seeds that flower years or decades later, Corinne. I've been fortunate to maintain connections with many former students throughout their adult lives. Like Dr. Chen, apparently, Preston observed with newfound respect. And many others, I confirmed. Physicians, engineers, researchers, entrepreneurs, all shaped in some measure by their mathematical education. That continuity, that ongoing connection to young minds developing over time, has been one of teaching's greatest rewards. More rewarding than financial success? Xavier asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, its directness creating a momentary silence around the table. It was, in many ways, the heart of what my family was struggling to understand. How I could have pursued teaching when more lucrative paths were available, and how I could have accumulated significant wealth while apparently indifferent to its trappings. They aren't mutually exclusive, Xavier, I replied carefully. Financial success has provided security and freedom. Teaching provided purpose and connection. I've been fortunate to experience both, on my own terms. Nathaniel cleared his throat, seemingly moved by my response. I think what we're all trying to understand, Eleanor, is why you chose to keep your financial success private for so long, particularly from family. It was a fair question, one I had anticipated. Still, articulating my reasons without causing offense required consideration. Initially, it wasn't a deliberate choice, I began. My investments were modest, my lifestyle aligned with my teaching salary. As my portfolio grew, I simply maintained the same patterns, living comfortably but without ostentation, focusing on what genuinely enhanced my quality of life, rather than external markers of success. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. As for privacy within the family, perhaps I sensed that financial disclosure would fundamentally alter how you perceived me. That once viewed through the lens of wealth, other aspects of my identity, my career, my interests, my values, might be diminished or distorted. And were you right? Abigail asked quietly. Has our perception of you changed since Bellamy's? The directness of her question was refreshing, if uncomfortable. I looked around the table, meeting each family member's gaze briefly before responding. Yes, I said simply. Though whether that change reflects genuine interest in knowing me more fully or merely reassessment of my value remains to be seen. My candor created another moment of silence, broken unexpectedly by Josephine's laugh, sharp and genuine. "Well, that's fair," she acknowledged. "We've been rather transparent in our sudden increased interest, haven't we? I suppose 50 years of condescension can't be undone in a week." Her honesty lightened the moment, allowing others to smile ruefully at the truth in her observation. "Perhaps we could start fresh," suggested Marcus, Abigail's husband, who had remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, not pretending the past didn't happen, but deliberately choosing to build new relationships based on who we all are now. It was an insightful suggestion from the family member I knew least well. Marcus had married Abigail 5 years earlier after her divorce from her first husband. As a sociology professor at Lakeshore University, he had always seemed slightly apart from the family's business-oriented culture. "I'd like that," I said sincerely. "As would I," Nathaniel agreed, surprising me with the emotion evident in his voice. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology for years of, well, frankly, for years of patronizing you. Your career choice, your lifestyle. I viewed them through my own narrow lens of success rather than recognizing their intrinsic value. I missed the opportunity to know my sister as the remarkable woman she is. The uncharacteristic vulnerability from my normally reserved brother touched me deeply. Thank you, Nathaniel. That means a great deal." As brunch concluded and family members began to disperse, Abigail approached me privately while I was collecting my handbag. "Aunt Eleanor," she began hesitantly, "I've been wanting to ask you something, but I wasn't sure how to broach the subject." "Go ahead," I encouraged, curious about what had my typically confident niece looking so uncertain. "My daughter, Sophia. You know she's 17 now, finishing her junior year at Westlake Prep?" I nodded, recalling the quiet, thoughtful girl I saw at holiday gatherings. She's struggling with some decisions about college and career path. Her father, my ex-husband, is pushing for business school, following the family tradition. But Sophie's passionate about environmental science, particularly forest ecology. They've been arguing constantly. "And how can I help?" I asked, genuinely interested. Abigail hesitated. "Would you be willing to talk with her? Share your perspective on choosing a path based on passion rather than family expectations? You're the only one in our circle who's truly forged an independent course." The request surprised and moved me. For the first time, a family member was seeking my guidance not because of my newly revealed wealth, but because of the values and choices that had shaped my life. "I'd be delighted to speak with Sophia," I assured her. "Perhaps she could visit me for tea next week. My garden is lovely this time of year." "That would be wonderful," Abigail said, visible relief in her expression. "She admires you, you know. Even before the Bellamy's revelation. She told me once that you were the only grown-up who asked about her interests rather than her grades or college plans." This glimpse into my great-niece's perception touched me unexpectedly. I had always made a point of engaging meaningfully with the younger generation at family gatherings, but had never been sure whether my efforts were appreciated or even noticed. "I look forward to our conversation," I told Abigail sincerely. "Tell her she's welcome any afternoon next week." As I drove home from Nathaniel's, I reflected on the morning's interactions. The family dynamic had indeed shifted, though not entirely, as I had anticipated. Yes, there was newfound respect based on my financial success, Preston's interest in my investment strategy, Xavier's contribution to the foundation, but there were also glimmers of more authentic connection. Nathaniel's apology, Abigail's request regarding Sophia, Josephine's refreshing candor about the family's changed perception. Whether these initial openings would develop into meaningful relationships remained to be seen. Patterns established over decades don't transform overnight, regardless of catalyzing revelations. But for the first time in years, I felt cautiously optimistic about my family connections. Not because they now viewed me as financially successful, but because that revelation had created space for them to see me more fully as a person. The remainder of the day passed in pleasant solitude, reading in my garden, preparing class materials for the final week of term, and reviewing foundation documents sent by Dominic's legal team. By evening, my thoughts had turned from family matters to the week ahead, particularly the centennial celebration scheduled for Saturday. According to Headmaster Wellington, the event would include the formal announcement of my retirement, the establishment of the Eleanor Blackwell Excellence in Mathematics Award, and a reception honoring my 50 years of service. Former students from across 5 decades had been invited, along with current faculty, board members, and distinguished alumni. The scale of the celebration both touched and unsettled me. Throughout my career, I had preferred to work quietly, finding satisfaction in individual student achievements rather than public recognition. Now I would be the center of attention at an event designed specifically to honor my contributions. I was contemplating this prospect Monday morning over breakfast when my telephone rang. Again, the landline that few people called these days. "Ms. Blackwell, this is Thaddeus Wellington. I hope I'm not disturbing your morning." "Not at all. Headmaster. What can I do for you?" There was a pause. Then, "We've had an unexpected development regarding the centennial celebration. The anonymous donor who contributed $50,000 to your scholarship fund has come forward with an additional proposal. They'd like to name the mathematics wing after you, effective immediately, with a formal dedication during Saturday's ceremony." The news caught me off guard. Having a teaching award named in my honor was one thing. Having an entire wing of the school bear my name was quite another. "That's extremely generous," I said carefully. "Though perhaps excessive? I've simply been doing my job, Thaddeus." "For 50 years, Eleanor," he reminded me gently, "with extraordinary impact. The donor feels strongly that your contribution to Heathcliff deserves permanent recognition." "May I ask who this donor is?" I inquired, genuinely curious about this anonymous benefactor who seemed determined to honor my career. Wellington hesitated. "They've requested anonymity until the dedication ceremony. I can assure you it's someone who holds you in the highest esteem." After concluding the call, I sat for some time with my cooling tea, contemplating this latest development. Who among my former students or colleagues had both the means and the motivation for such a gesture? Dominic was an obvious possibility, though his foundation contributions suggested he had already found his way to honor my influence. Perhaps a parent of a former student. Over 5 decades, I had taught children from some of Lakeshire's wealthiest families, many of whom had gone on to significant success themselves. The question followed me to Heathcliff that morning, where I continued the bittersweet process of clearing out my classroom. Decades of accumulated materials filled boxes destined for younger colleagues, the school archive, or my home office. Each item carried memories. The calculus textbook with my handwritten notes dating back to 1975, the collection of mathematical puzzles I had used to engage reluctant learners, the framed photograph of the 1992 mathematics team that had won the state championship against schools twice Heathcliff's size. Margaret joined me during our shared free period, ostensibly to help but primarily to continue our conversation from Friday's lunch. "I'm still processing the foundation news," she admitted, carefully wrapping my crystal paperweight in tissue paper. "All these years, I thought I knew you, Eleanor." "You do know me," I assured her. "My financial circumstances don't change who I am." She considered this, head tilted thoughtfully. "Perhaps not fundamentally, but they certainly add dimension. I keep thinking about all those faculty meetings where we complained about salaries and benefits, and you just listened with that enigmatic smile." I laughed softly. "What would you have had me say? Don't worry about the pension plan, colleagues. Just invest consistently for 50 years and you too can establish a multi-million-dollar foundation?" "When you put it that way," Margaret conceded with a smile. Then, more seriously, I'm not upset that you kept your financial success private, Eleanor. I'm just curious about why. We've been friends for 25 years. Did you think I would treat you differently? It was a fair question from someone who had indeed been a friend rather than merely a colleague. I considered my answer carefully. Privacy became habitual, Margaret. I learned early in my career that people relate differently to those they perceive as wealthy. Some become deferential, others resentful. Few continue to see you clearly as a person rather than a resource or symbol. Over time, I found it simpler to keep my financial life separate from my professional identity. She nodded slowly. I can understand that. Though I'd like to think I would have passed the friendship test regardless. I believe you would have, I assured her sincerely. But habits of privacy, once established, are difficult to break. Well, the secret's out now, she observed, reaching for another item to pack. How does it feel, being known? The question gave me pause. How did it feel, having my carefully maintained privacy dissolve so suddenly? There was discomfort in the exposure, certainly, but also an unexpected sense of liberation. No more careful compartmentalization of my life, no more deflection of personal questions, no more calculated modesty to maintain others' comfortable perceptions. Complicated, I admitted finally, but not entirely unwelcome. There's a certain freedom in authenticity, even if it comes with increased scrutiny. Margaret smiled, recognizing the philosophical turn our conversation had taken. Spoken like a true mathematician, always looking for the elegant solution, even to life's messiest equations. We worked in companionable silence for a while, sorting through decades of accumulated materials. Occasionally, one of us would pause over a particular item. A student thank you note, a faculty award, a photograph from a school event, sharing the memory it evoked before carefully placing it in the appropriate box. Will you miss it? Margaret asked eventually, gesturing around the classroom with its chalk-dusted blackboards and precisely arranged desks. Teaching, I mean. The daily rhythm of it. Parts of it, I acknowledged honestly. The moment when a struggling student finally grasps a difficult concept. The satisfaction of crafting the perfect explanatory example. The relationships built over years with students who return to share their successes. I paused, considering. But perhaps it's time for new challenges. The foundation will keep me connected to mathematics education, just in a different capacity. And what about personal plans? She inquired. Travel, hobbies, perhaps even romance. Retirement opens many doors, you know. I laughed at her suggestive tone regarding romance. At 78? I think that particular door has long since closed, Margaret. Don't be so sure, she responded with a mischievous smile. My mother found love at 82, married her retirement community dance instructor, and had 5 blissfully happy years with him before he passed. Age is no barrier to connection. The notion seemed absurd on its face. Me, Eleanor Blackwell, spinster mathematics teacher for 5 decades, suddenly embarking on romance in my late 70s. And yet, Margaret's words planted a small seed of possibility, not romance specifically perhaps, but openness to new experiences, new connections, new dimensions of life that I hadn't previously considered accessible. Travel is definitely on the agenda, I told her, returning to safer conversational ground. I've always wanted to visit New Zealand, particularly the South Island, and Japan during cherry blossom season. Beyond that, we'll see what opportunities arise. As we finished packing the last box, a knock at the classroom door interrupted our conversation. I looked up to see Headmaster Wellington accompanied by a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, whom I immediately recognized despite the decades since I had last seen him. Ms. Blackwell, Wellington began formally. I believe you know Dr. Harrison Pierce. He's here to discuss some details regarding Saturday's celebration. Harrison Pierce, class of '78, valedictorian, National Merit Scholar, and eventually renowned cardiothoracic surgeon. More pertinently, the student with whom I had engaged in a spirited months-long debate about whether mathematics or medicine was the more foundational discipline for human advancement. The debate had culminated in a public forum that became something of a legend at Heathcliff, with faculty and students filling the auditorium to witness our intellectual sparring. "Dr. Pierce," I greeted him, extending my hand. "It's been many years." "Far too many, Miss Blackwell," he replied, his handshake firm and warm. "Though I've followed your career from afar. 50 years at Heathcliff, a remarkable legacy." Wellington, apparently satisfied with the introduction, excused himself with a murmured comment about administrative matters requiring his attention. Margaret, sensing a private conversation developing, gathered her belongings with a whispered promise to continue our discussion later. As they departed, Harrison Pierce gazed around my half-dismantled classroom with evident nostalgia. "It looks smaller than I remember. Funny how memory works. The room hasn't changed," I assured him, "but perspective shifts with time and experience." He smiled at the observation, then turned to face me directly. "I imagine you're wondering why I'm here, Ms. Blackwell." The thought had crossed my mind, I acknowledged. "Headmaster Wellington mentioned something about Saturday's celebration." Harrison nodded, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I understand there's to be a dedication of the mathematics wing in your honor. I wanted to ensure that the plaque meets with your approval before it's permanently installed." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a velvet-wrapped package, which he placed on my desk and carefully unwrapped to reveal a bronze plaque. The inscription read, "The Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Center." Dedicated to the teacher who showed generations of students that mathematics is not merely a subject to be studied, but a language through which the universe reveals its deepest truths. Established May 2025 in honor of her 50 years of distinguished service, the wording was elegant and deeply moving, capturing the essence of my approach to teaching mathematics with unexpected precision. "It's lovely," I said, genuinely touched, though I'm still not entirely comfortable with such public recognition. The discomfort of the honoree is often inversely proportional to the merit of the honor," Harrison observed with a smile. "Put another way, those most deserving of recognition are frequently those least comfortable receiving it." I studied him more carefully, a suspicion forming in my mind. "Are you, by any chance, the anonymous donor Wellington mentioned?" His expression remained deliberately neutral. "The donor prefers to remain anonymous until Saturday's ceremony." "That's not a denial, Harrison." He smiled slightly. "No, it's not." Then, changing the subject, "I understand you're establishing a foundation with Dominic Torres. Mathematics education for underserved communities, an admirable initiative." "Thank you," I replied, allowing the deflection for the moment. "It's work I believe in deeply." "As do I," he said, surprising me. "In fact, I'd like to discuss potential collaboration between your foundation and the Pierce Family Health Initiative. We've been developing STEM education programs for underrepresented students entering medical fields. There's natural synergy with your mathematical focus." The proposal was unexpected, but intriguing. I'd be very interested in exploring that possibility. Perhaps after the centennial celebration? "Perfect. We could meet for lunch next week to discuss details." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "And perhaps we could continue our debate about the relative importance of mathematics versus medicine. If memory serves, we never did reach a conclusive resolution." The suggestion brought a genuine smile to my face. That decades-old intellectual sparring match had been one of the highlights of my early teaching career. Challenging, stimulating, and immensely enjoyable. "I'd like that," I told him sincerely. "Though I should warn you, my position has only strengthened with time." "As has mine," he countered with mock seriousness. We may need more than lunch to settle the matter once and for all. Dinner, then, I suggested impulsively. The week after next, perhaps? My treat. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my directness. I'd be delighted, though I insist on paying. Professional courtesy. Doctors always pick up the check. For teachers, it's practically in the Hippocratic Oath. I laughed, enjoying the easy banter that had resumed as if decades hadn't intervened. Very well, I'll concede that point. But don't expect similar concessions in our mathematical medical debate. As Harrison departed, promising to finalize details for both our lunch meeting and dinner engagement, I found myself contemplating this unexpected development with a mixture of surprise and pleasure. What had begun as a professional discussion about foundation collaboration had somehow evolved into what felt suspiciously like a date? At 78? The notion was as ridiculous as it was exhilarating. And yet, why not? Retirement was opening doors I hadn't anticipated, new professional opportunities through the foundation, new family dynamics following my financial revelation, and now, potentially, new personal connections as well. Margaret's words about her mother finding love at 82 echoed in my thoughts. Perhaps age truly was no barrier to connection, intellectual, emotional, or otherwise. Perhaps this final chapter of my life might contain surprises beyond anything I had imagined during those decades of careful planning and disciplined investing. As I locked my classroom door for what might be the final time, I felt an unexpected surge of anticipation for what lay ahead. 50 years of teaching had shaped me profoundly, but they hadn't defined me completely. There were still equations to solve, theorems to prove, connections to make, in mathematics and in life. The future stretched before me, not as a winding down, but as an opening up. And for the first time in many years, I found myself genuinely curious about what it might hold. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself had decided to honor my 5 decades at Heathcliff Academy. I stood before my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my royal blue dress, a new purchase for this occasion, something I rarely indulged in. At 78, I found myself facing a day of public recognition with a mixture of trepidation and quiet pride. The centennial celebration would begin at noon, with hundreds of guests expected, current students, faculty, board members, and alumni, spanning 5 decades of Heathcliff history. Among them would be my family, seeing me in my professional element, for the first time. Nathaniel had called yesterday to confirm their attendance, mentioning that even Xavier was flying back early from a business trip in Tokyo to be present. Their newfound interest in my career was still an adjustment, gratifying yet strange after so many years of indifference. As I gathered my things to leave, my gaze fell on Vivian Reynolds' investment journal, which I had placed on my bedside table the night before. A wave of gratitude washed over me for her guidance, which had shaped not just my financial life, but my entire approach to building something meaningful over time. I tucked the small journal into my handbag, a talisman of sorts for this transitional day. The Heathcliff campus was transformed when I arrived. Banners celebrating the school's centennial hung from historic buildings, flowers adorned every entrance, and a large tent had been erected on the main lawn for the reception. Staff bustled about with last-minute preparations while early arrivals gathered in small clusters, many faces familiar to me despite the passage of years. Ms. Blackwell. The voice belonged to Zachariah Pembroke, my former student now in his 50s, accompanied by a young man who bore his unmistakable features. I'd like you to meet my son, Matthew. He's starting at MIT this fall. Mathematics, of course. Throughout the morning, similar reunions multiplied. Former students, now accomplished adults, many with children of their own, all eager to share how mathematics had shaped their lives. Their stories formed a living testament to the ripple effects of education, impacts extending far beyond what any teacher can witness directly. At precisely noon, Headmaster Wellington called the gathering to order. From my seat on the stage, I could see my family in the front row: Nathaniel and Corinne, Xavier, Josephine, Preston, Abigail and Marcus, even great-nieces and nephews I barely knew. Their presence moved me unexpectedly. Wellington's opening. Remarks traced Heathcliff's century of educational excellence, leading naturally to recognition of my contribution to that legacy. When he invited me to the podium, the applause was sustained and genuine, warming me despite my lifelong discomfort with public attention. For 50 years, I began, I have had the privilege of teaching mathematics at Heathcliff Academy. Many would call this dedication. I call it good fortune. I spoke briefly about my journey, the joy of witnessing young minds engage with mathematical concepts, the satisfaction of maintaining connections with students across decades, the profound belief in education as the most powerful force for positive change in our world. Mathematics teaches us that patterns matter, I continued. That consistency, applied over time, yields remarkable results. That what seems impossible can become beautifully, elegantly possible with the right approach. These principles hold true not just in equations, but in life itself. As I concluded my remarks, Wellington stepped forward again, this time accompanied by Harrison Pierce. "We have one final announcement," Wellington said. "As many of you know, the Mathematics Wing will henceforth be known as the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Center. What you may not know is the identity of the donor who made this possible, along with a substantial endowment to ensure the center's programs flourish for generations to come." Harrison stepped to the microphone. "Ms. Blackwell once told me that if I ever decided mathematics was more fundamental than medicine, she would consider her teaching career complete." Laughter rippled through the audience. While I still maintain that medicine deserves equal billing, I cannot overstate the impact her teaching had on my life and career. This dedication honors not just her 50 years at Heathcliff, but the thousands of lives she has shaped through her extraordinary gift for illuminating mathematical truths. The revelation of Harrison as the anonymous donor touched me deeply, not just for the generosity of the gesture, but for the full circle moment it represented. My former student, once a brilliant teenager arguing passionately for the primacy of medicine, now honoring the mathematical foundation that had helped shape his remarkable career. When the formal proceedings concluded, I found myself surrounded by well-wishers, colleagues, former students, family members, all waiting to speak with me. Among them was Sophia, Abigail's daughter, who approached somewhat shyly. "Great Aunt Eleanor," she began, "Mom told me about your offer to talk about college choices. I'd really like that. What you said today about patterns and consistency. It made me think about my own path differently. I look forward to our conversation," I told her sincerely, seeing in her earnest expression echoes of my own youthful uncertainty about choosing an authentic path. Later, as the celebration transitioned to an informal reception, my family gathered around me, their expressions holding newfound respect that went beyond my recently revealed financial status. "I had no idea," Nathaniel said simply, "about the impact of your work, the way those former students speak about you." He shook his head, genuinely moved. "Teaching has its own wealth," I replied, "measured in moments of understanding, in lives touched, in knowledge passed forward." As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, I found myself walking the familiar corridors of Heathcliff one last time as a teacher. Outside what would now be called the Eleanor Blackwell Mathematics Center, Harrison was waiting. "I wanted to check that you weren't overwhelmed by today's recognition," he said, falling into step beside me. "Not overwhelmed," I assured him. Honored, certainly, and perhaps a bit bemused to find myself the center of so much attention after decades of quiet work. "Some contributions can't remain quiet forever," he observed, "even when the contributor prefers it that way." We walked in companionable silence for a moment before he spoke again. "Our dinner next week. I'm looking forward to it. 50 years. Seems long enough to wait for a rematch of our great debate. I smiled, feeling a surprising flutter of anticipation. Indeed. Though I should warn you, my arguments have only grown more refined with time. As have mine, he countered with a smile. Perhaps we should make it a standing engagement, monthly dinners to continue the discussion indefinitely. The suggestion held possibilities I hadn't considered until that moment. Intellectual companionship, perhaps even something more in this new chapter of my life. I believe that could be arranged, I replied. That evening, returning to my empty house after a day of connection and celebration, I felt none of the melancholy I had anticipated. Instead, a sense of openness filled me, an awareness that endings inevitably create space for new beginnings. For 50 years, I had built my life brick by brick, my career, my investments, my home, my relationships. Now, at 78, I found myself not at an ending, but at a transition point, with both the financial security and the hard-earned wisdom to shape whatever came next. My family had finally seen me clearly. My students had affirmed the value of my life's work. My future held new purposes through the foundation, new connections both professional and personal, new opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. As I prepared for bed, I placed Vivian's journal back on its shelf, no longer needing its tangible reassurance. Her wisdom had been thoroughly integrated into my life, the understanding that true wealth accumulates slowly, consistently, in ways often invisible, until viewed across the full arc of a life. My worth had never been measured in dollars, despite what my family had briefly believed. It existed in the lives I had touched, the minds I had helped shape, the difference I had made by showing up day after day, year after year, for work that mattered deeply. That was the investment that had truly compounded over time. Not the millions in my portfolio, impressive though they were, but the immeasurable returns of a life lived with purpose, integrity, and quiet determination. Tomorrow would bring new equations to solve, new theorems to prove, new patterns to discover, in mathematics and in life. I was ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.